Welcome to the Wednesday night Bible study. We're looking at the story of Daniel, and this is the 9th installment, and in fact it's the last one. This is going to cover the second half of Daniel chapter 6, which is the verses 11 through 28. I'm calling this the Lion's Den, the story we've probably all grown up with, right up there with David and Goliath, or maybe Noah's Ark. Now, if you remember last week, in the first half of chapter 6, the Medo-Persians took over Babylon. King Darius was now in charge. This king appointed Daniel as one of the 3 administrators over 120 satraps or governors. And the king, as we read, was thinking of promoting him, setting him as leader over everything, promoting him over even the other administrators. The other administrators and the satraps didn't like this, so they came up with a plot where they tricked the king into decreeing that in the next 30 days, no one could pray to any god or man other than the king, or they would be thrown into the lion's den. And what did Daniel do? A man of integrity? He did this. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. So Daniel continued to pray to God, just as he had done before. All right, the decree was made and Daniel is not following it. We can presume this is what his enemies expected. They had their evidence now. As we read in verse 11, then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or man except to you, O king, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So they've succeeded in setting Daniel up. They caught Daniel praying. And then they got the king to say he would enforce his decree. And especially got the king to say that the decree couldn't be repealed. Now it was time for these men to make good on their scheme. Verse 13, then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. So even the king looks like he realizes this was a trap. The king was duped. The king thought highly of Daniel and didn't want anything bad to happen to him, apparently. To finish the job, these schemers threw the king's words back at him in verse 15. Then the men went as a group to the king and said to him, remember, O king, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. They did have the king over a barrel. It was Daniel who was going to have to pay the price. And then unfortunately, so the king, in verse 16, gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. But what the king just said to Daniel was an extraordinary statement from a pagan king. And in fact, some of the translations of the king's statement go a step further. In fact, the New American Standard translates the second half of verse 16 this way. The king spoke and said to Daniel, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. To me, that sounds more like a statement, like an assurance, than a hope or a wish. The king and Daniel must have developed a friendship open enough for Daniel to talk about God with the king. And the king might have thought, Daniel is a very sensible man, and Daniel was willing to risk his life for this God. Perhaps this God could come through for Daniel. So Daniel is thrown into the lion's den. What happens next? Most of us know the story, but let's continue. Verse 17. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. To get a mental picture of what a lion's den looked like, here's the words of commentator C.F. Keal, K-E-A-L. He describes similar dens found in Morocco as being large, square, subterranean caverns divided by a center wall with a door in it to transfer the animals to either side for feeding and cleaning. This reminds me of what you might see at a zoo. The cavern had two openings, one above that was ringed with a short wall and remained open to let in fresh air, and the mouth and entrance on the side that was covered by a large flat stone. J. Dwight Pentecost writes that the seal, an impression made in clay by an image on a ring, would inform others that the stone was not to be tampered with in an effort to free Daniel. Okay, so there is Daniel is in there in the lion's den. Verse 18, then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. I think the king really does feel very fondly of Daniel here. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? So the king was fearing the worst. Instead, he found a miracle. In verse 21, Daniel answered, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king. Hallelujah. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. So those last few words say it all about Daniel, about his whole life, because he trusted in his God. And the story continues. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. To me, that's a little bit over punishment. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. And I guess that ruins the theory Daniel was spared because the lions weren't hungry. They definitely were hungry. So just like what King Nebuchadnezzar did when he saw God's power against the fiery furnace that we read about weeks ago, King Darius proclaims the glory of Daniel's God. In verse 25, then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language throughout the land, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. And then he continues, for he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. There it is. Those are wise words, true words. God is king. His kingdom will last forever. He cares for those who trust in him. And I think the ultimate message is never lose hope. And then we close the story with this happy thought. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So Daniel has been rescued. The king is happy. Daniel's enemies are no more. And God has been glorified. So it says that Daniel prospers. Also translated as enjoyed success. Daniel enjoyed success during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus. He wasn't just successful in his last years, though. He was successful his whole life. And it wasn't limited to his political or career success. Daniel prospered and was successful by being obedient and trusting God. And Daniel saw to it that God's glory was always shining forth. So when we face our own lion's den situations, maybe another way to describe trials in our lives, this was definitely a trial for Daniel. We run into trials, our own lion's dens. And sometimes it's by our own doing, sometimes it's out of our control. It'd be good to think of Daniel and have an attitude like his. He was a person of integrity, a person trusting God, a person who didn't waver from walking with God. And when we're in the middle of those trials, it'd also be good to think of God the way the king did in verse 27. I'll put that up again. God is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel, and he will rescue us. And he has rescued us so many times already from the power of the lions. Well, this concludes our story of Daniel. It's not the end of the book of Daniel. There are another 6 chapters. I encourage you to read the second half of the book of Daniel, but we won't go into that. It's not a historical account of Daniel. It moves from history to prophecy. Very important stuff, fascinating stuff. I do encourage you to read that. But this is the end of our study of Daniel, the character of a man, of a person who it would be great for us all to emulate. So you all take care. May the Lord be with you.